Prologue: Shadows before dawn. The Baltic Sea churned grey and restless under a low winter sky. Along the Estonian shore, where the island of Saaremaa met the mainland, the waves lapped against the hull of a longship, half buried in sand. Not the carefully preserved vessel of a chieftain, but a war-torn craft hastily covered in earth. The year was approximately 750 AD, nearly half a century before the world would come to know and fear the name Viking. Inside this maritime grave lay the bodies of 7 men. Their bones, preserved by the sandy soil, told a tale more horrific than any saga yet composed in the northern lands. One man's skull bore the unmistakable mark of a blade strike, a perfect square hole, punched through bone. Another's hands were nearly severed, defensive wounds from a desperate final stand. A third had been decapitated, the vertebrae of his neck showing the clean slice of a well-honed sword. Nearby, a larger ship grave contained 33 more warriors, their remains arranged in careful rows, weapons still clutched in skeletal hands. These men had not died peacefully. They had met violent ends far from home, their bodies collected and buried with honours by their surviving comrades. This is the Salme burial site, archaeological evidence of Scandinavian warriors engaged in organised violence nearly 50 years before the infamous raid on Lindisfarne Abbey that traditionally marks the beginning of the Viking Age. The men buried here were not yet called Vikings, but they were their immediate predecessors, the vanguard of what would become the most feared maritime power in early medieval Europe. Who were these proto-Vikings? What drove them to sail beyond their homelands into hostile territories? How did they develop the ships, weapons, and tactics that would make their descendants infamous throughout the known world? The answers lie buried in the cold earth of northern Europe, in sunken ships and forgotten graves, in the scorched remains of coastal settlements, and the scattered silver hoards hidden by those who never returned to claim them. This is the story of the first Vikings, a tale of desperation and innovation, of horrific violence and remarkable adaptation. It begins not with the dramatic raid on Lindisfarne in 793 AD that shocked Christendom, but in the shadows of the preceding centuries, when the foundations of Viking power were being forged in blood and iron along the shores of Scandinavia. The crucible of the North. The unforgiving land. The story begins in the harsh landscape of Scandinavia during the 7th century. Here, in what would later become Denmark, Norway and Sweden, a perfect storm of environmental, social and political factors was brewing that would eventually unleash the Viking phenomenon upon the world. Svein Thorvaldsson awoke to the sound of his youngest child crying. The winter had been the harshest in living memory, and the spring that followed brought little relief. Now, as summer approached, their stores were depleted, and hunger had become a constant companion in their small farmstead near what would one day be called Uppland in Sweden. His wife Frida stirred beside him on their straw mattress. "The child needs food," she whispered, her voice hollow with exhaustion. "We all do." Svein rose and walked to the centre of their longhouse, where embers still glowed in the hearth. The building, once home to 3 generations of his family and several thralls, now felt cavernous. His parents had not survived the winter. 2 of his 5 children had succumbed to illness, exacerbated by hunger. Even 2 of their precious cattle had been slaughtered prematurely, the meat quickly consumed and the remainder spoiled before they could properly preserve it. Through the smoke hole in the roof, Svein could see stars beginning to fade as dawn approached. He had a decision to make, one that had been forming in his mind through the long, desperate winter. The land had always been unforgiving in the north. Farming was possible, but precarious. The growing season was short, and the soil in many areas too thin or rocky for substantial yields. For centuries, Scandinavians had supplemented their agricultural efforts with hunting, fishing, and localised trade. But something had changed. The climate had grown colder over recent decades. Harvests failed more frequently. Population had grown during better years, and now there were too many mouths to feed. Political changes were compounding these natural challenges. Small kingdoms were consolidating across Scandinavia. Local chieftains who once maintained power through gift-giving and feast-hosting could no longer afford such generosity. Young warriors found fewer opportunities to gain wealth and status through service to these traditional leaders. As Svein stoked the fire, his eldest son Halfdan entered the main room. At 16, he was already taller than his father, with broad shoulders and calloused hands from working the land. "You're thinking about it again," Halfdan said. It wasn't a question. Svein nodded. Bjorn Ironsides returned from the east last autumn. His men carried silver, furs, and amber. They lost only 2 ships, and those to storms, not enemies. "The gods favoured them," Halfdan replied. "The gods favour those who act," Svein corrected. "Bjorn is sailing again when the ice breaks in the eastern waters. He seeks men." "You would leave us?" Freydis had entered silently, their youngest child balanced on her hip. Svein met her gaze. "I would save us. One successful voyage could bring enough wealth to see us through many winters, to rebuild our herd, to perhaps even buy more land. Or to bury you in foreign soil," she countered, but there was no force behind her words. She too could see the inexorable logic of their situation. Similar conversations were occurring in longhouses across Scandinavia. Environmental pressure, population growth, and political consolidation were creating a class of men with few options. They were skilled in warfare, all free men trained from boyhood with weapons, but had diminishing opportunities to use those skills in service to local leaders. They were experienced sailors, coastal navigation being essential in the fjord-carved landscape, but had traditionally ventured only short distances from home. Now necessity was pushing them to look beyond their traditional horizons. East across the Baltic Sea lay lands rich in resources. South and west lay the wealthy but increasingly vulnerable communities of the post-Roman world. The stage was set for expansion. All that was needed was the means and the opportunity. The ships that changed history. The key to understanding the emergence of the Viking phenomenon lies not just in why they ventured forth, but how. The decisive technological advantage that enabled their unprecedented mobility was their ships. By the mid-8th century, Scandinavian shipwrights had developed vessels unlike any others in Europe. The iconic longship was still evolving, but its essential characteristics were already present in earlier vessels like those found at the Salme burial site. Gudmund the shipwright ran his weathered hand along the curved strake of oak. 50 years of crafting vessels had left his fingers permanently bent, as though still gripping adze and hammer. His latest creation lay before him on the shore, its hull taking shape like a massive wooden leaf. "She'll be the swiftest yet," he told Bjorn Ironsides, who had commissioned the vessel. Shallow draft to navigate rivers, flexible enough to ride ocean waves, strong enough to carry 40 men and their gear. Bjorn walked the length of the partially completed ship. Unlike the rounded merchant vessels of the Frisians or the heavy warships of the Byzantine Empire, this craft was long, narrow, and elegantly proportioned. Most revolutionary was its construction method, the clinker-built technique, where hull planks overlap like scales, making the ship both lighter and more flexible than vessels built elsewhere in Europe. "The keel?" Bjorn asked, eyeing the backbone of the ship. "Single piece of oak seasoned 3 winters," Gudmund answered with pride. "Found it myself in the King's Forest. Cost me a silver arm ring to the forest warden to look the other way." Bjorn nodded approvingly. "And the sail?" "My wife and daughters have been weaving all winter. Finest wool, tight woven and treated with horse fat to shed water. It will catch the lightest breeze." What made these ships revolutionary was their versatility. They could be powered by sail when conditions permitted, allowing crews to conserve energy for fighting or trading. When winds failed or precision was needed, they could be rowed by the same warriors who would later wield weapons. Most critically, their shallow draft meant they could navigate not just seas, but rivers and streams, penetrating deep into continental interiors. This combination, seaworthiness, shallow draft, and dual propulsion, created vessels that could appear suddenly from the horizon, land on almost any beach or riverbank, and depart just as quickly. They were the perfect platforms for hit-and-run raids, but equally valuable for trade expeditions that might need to escape hostile attention. The ships represented a massive investment of resources and expertise. A large vessel required dozens of tall, straight oak trees, increasingly scarce in parts of Scandinavia due to land clearance for agriculture. The iron rivets that held the strakes together represented weeks of a blacksmith's labour. The sail alone might consume a year of textile production from several households. Such investments required organisation and leadership. The emerging proto-Viking expeditions were not random acts of desperation, but coordinated enterprises led by experienced sailors and warriors, often younger sons of chieftains or ambitious men seeking to establish their own power base, independent of traditional hierarchies. As Gudmund and his apprentices worked through the winter, similar vessels were taking shape along coasts and fjords across Scandinavia. A new type of ship was emerging, and with it, a new type of warfare and trade. Opportunistic, mobile, and reaching far beyond traditional Scandinavian waters. The stage was set, the motivation existed, the technology was ready. All that remained was for someone to prove the concept, to demonstrate that the risks of venturing into foreign waters could yield rewards worth the danger. The first ventures. The earliest proto-Viking expeditions left few written records. They occurred before literacy was widespread in Scandinavia, and their targets often lacked the chroniclers who would later document Viking raids in such horrified detail. But archaeology provides tantalizing glimpses of these first ventures, particularly eastward across the Baltic. Halfdan stood at the prow of his father's ship, scanning the approaching shoreline. At 18, this was his second expedition east, following the route pioneered by Bjorn Ironsides and others before him. Behind their vessel sailed two more ships, each carrying 30 warriors from their home region. They had navigated the Baltic Sea, entered the Gulf of Finland, and now approached the lands of the Finnic and Slavic peoples. There, his father Svein pointed to a natural harbour partly concealed by a wooded headland. We'll make camp there, send scouts to the settlement. The settlement in question was what would later be known as Staraya Ladoga, one of the earliest trading posts established along the eastern routes. Archaeological evidence shows Scandinavian presence here by the mid-8th century, decades before the traditional start of the Viking Age. As their ships beached on the shore, Halfdan supervised the younger warriors in establishing a defensive perimeter. Though they came primarily to trade, violence was always a possibility. Every man was armed, swords for those who could afford them, axes and spears for the rest. Most carried round wooden shields reinforced with iron bosses. Remember, Svein instructed the assembled crew once camp was established. We are few, they are many. We trade first, we fight only if we must. This pragmatic approach characterized many early Scandinavian expeditions. While later Vikings would become infamous for their raids, the earliest ventures were often more complex interactions involving both trade and intimidation. The Scandinavians brought amber, honey, walrus ivory, and high-quality iron weapon to exchange for silver, furs, and slaves. 2 days later, a delegation from the nearby settlement arrived at their camp. Through a translator, a Finnic man who had spent time in Svein's homeland on previous trading missions, they negotiated terms. The Scandinavians would be allowed to establish a seasonal trading post, but no more than 10 warriors could enter the settlement at once, and all must leave their shields behind. Such precautions reflected the wary relationship between the newcomers and local populations. The Scandinavians were recognised as valuable trading partners, but also potential threats. Their superior naval technology gave them mobility that land-based powers struggled to counter, and their martial culture made them dangerous opponents. Over the following weeks, Svein's expedition engaged in trade, exchanging goods they had brought from home for local products. They also served as middlemen, using their ships to transport goods between settlements along the coast and rivers. By summer's end, their vessels rode lower in the water, laden with furs, silver, amber, and other valuable commodities. Not all early expeditions ended so peacefully. The Salma ship burials in Estonia tell a different story, one of violent conflict. The warriors buried there died in battle around 750 EUR-ED, their wounds indicating fierce hand-to-hand combat. They were buried with Scandinavian weapons, and according to Scandinavian practices, suggesting they were not random raiders, but an organised force operating far from home. What caused this conflict? The archaeological record is silent on specifics, but patterns from later periods suggest possibilities. Perhaps a trading expedition turned violent when negotiations broke down. Maybe these were mercenaries hired by one local power to fight another, a common practice in later Viking activity in the east. Or perhaps they were indeed raiders who met unexpected resistance. Whatever the case, the Salme burials represent the earliest archaeological evidence of significant Scandinavian military activity beyond their homelands. A grim harbinger of the Viking expansion to come. As autumn approached and Baltic storms became more frequent, Svein gave the order to return home. Their expedition had been successful. They carried enough wealth to sustain their families through the winter and beyond. More importantly, they carried knowledge of roots, of trading practices, of local politics and vulnerabilities. This knowledge would spread through Scandinavian communities. Stories told around winter hearths would inspire others to venture forth when spring returned. With each expedition, the networks expanded, the techniques refined, the ambitions grew. The Proto-Viking Age was underway, building momentum toward the explosion of activity that would begin in the final years of the 8th century. But before the infamous raid on Lindisfarne would announce the Vikings to the Christian world, another critical development was taking shape. The emergence of more organised power in Scandinavia itself, blood and iron. The rise of warlords. As expeditions east and south began to yield wealth, power dynamics within Scandinavia shifted. Those who successfully led voyages gained not just material riches, but prestige and followers. A new type of leader was emerging, one whose power came not from traditional claims to land or ancestry alone, but from the ability to organise and lead profitable expeditions. Bjorn Ironsides stood before the assembled men of his region, his reputation now far exceeding that of the ageing local chieftain. 6 successful expeditions east had made him wealthy beyond the dreams of his forefathers. Silver arm rings encircled his massive forearms, a sword of pattern-welded steel, acquired from Frankish lands through trade, hung at his side. Behind him stood 40 hardened warriors who had sailed with him and shared in his successes. "The eastern routes grow more crowded each season," he announced. "The Finnic tribes and Slavs now expect our ships. They prepare defences. They organise their own warriors to protect their settlements." Murmurs ran through the crowd. Many had been planning their own expeditions, hoping to replicate Bjorn's success. "But there are other waters, other lands," Bjorn continued. "The Frisians tell of wealthy monasteries on islands to the west, places where Christian holy men keep gold and silver vessels for their god, places defended by prayers, not swords." The crowd grew silent, contemplating this new possibility. "I will sail west when the spring storms end," Bjorn declared. "I seek strong men and seaworthy ships. Those who join me will share in whatever we find, be it through trade or otherwise." The careful phrasing was deliberate. Bjorn's proposing something new, not just trading expeditions to established partners, but voyages of exploration and opportunity. Whether that opportunity came through peaceful exchange or violence would depend on circumstances. This shift reflected growing competition. As more Scandinavians ventured abroad, the most accessible trading partners became savvier, offering less favourable terms or strengthening their defences. Entrepreneurial leaders like Bjorn needed to find new opportunities, new targets, new routes. Archaeological evidence from this period shows increasing wealth and social stratification in Scandinavian settlements. Imported luxury goods appear more frequently in the graves of elites. Specialised crafting areas develop for working imported raw materials like exotic metals, amber and ivory. Power begins to concentrate in fewer hands. The emerging leaders were not yet kings in the later medieval sense, but they were more than traditional chieftains. They commanded resources that allowed them to build larger ships, arm more warriors, and undertake more ambitious expeditions. Their halls became centres not just of local administration, but of regional power projection. Crucially, these leaders derived significant authority from their success abroad. A chieftain who could lead profitable expeditions could attract more followers, afford better weapons and ships, and gradually extend control over neighbouring territories. The feedback loop between foreign adventure and domestic power was established, a dynamic that would characterise Viking politics for centuries to come. This evolving power structure created both opportunities and pressures. For ambitious young men, it offered paths to wealth and status outside traditional inheritance patterns. For established elites, it threatened disruption of old hierarchies. For ordinary farmers and craftspeople, it offered potential prosperity through new trade networks, but also demanded tribute to increasingly powerful local magnates. As Bjorn's call for Western expeditions spread, it represented more than just another trading venture. It signalled a new phase in Scandinavian expansion, one that would soon bring them into direct and violent contact with the Christian world to their south and west. Weapons of terror. The Proto-Vikings who ventured beyond Scandinavia carried with them not just goods for trade, but weapons for war. These weapons and the techniques used to wield them would become legendary for their effectiveness and the terror they inspired. In the smithy near Svein's farmstead, the blacksmith Ulf hammered glowing iron on his anvil. Sparks flew with each precise blow as he worked on a sword blade. Unlike the simple farm tools that occupied most of his time, this weapon represented the pinnacle of early medieval metallurgy. "It will be ready before you sail," Ulf assured Halfdan, who watched the process with keen interest. Now 20, Halfdan had participated in 3 eastern expeditions and accumulated enough wealth to commission his own sword, a significant investment and status symbol. "The pattern?" Halfdan asked, referring to the distinctive swirling designs that would be visible in the finished blade. 7 rods of iron, twisted and forge-welded, Ulf explained. 3 with higher carbon, 4 with lower. The edge will be hard enough to cut through mail, the core flexible enough to absorb blows without shattering. The sword-making techniques of Scandinavia represented sophisticated metallurgical knowledge. The best blades combined different types of iron, some carbon-rich and hard but brittle, others more flexible but softer, in layered patterns that provided both cutting-edge and structural integrity. The resulting weapons were not just effective but beautiful, with rippling patterns visible in the metal itself. While swords were prestigious, the most common weapons carried by Scandinavian warriors were spears and axes. Spears could be used for thrusting from behind a shield wall or throwing at short distances. Axes, from simple bearded hand axes to larger two-handed versions, could deliver devastating blows capable of splitting shields and helmets alike. Defensive equipment included round wooden shields reinforced with iron bosses and rims, and for wealthy warriors, mail shirts and helmets. The iconic horned helmets of popular imagination were largely absent. Practical combat headgear focused on protecting the skull and sometimes the face with less elaborate designs. Beyond the physical characteristics of their weapons, the Proto-Vikings developed fighting techniques that maximised their effectiveness in the types of conflicts they encountered. They excelled at amphibious operations, using their ships to achieve surprise and maintain mobility, striking targets near coasts and rivers, and withdrawing before larger forces could be mobilised against them. Remember how we approached the Kurland settlement last summer? Svein instructed a group of younger warriors preparing for their first expedition. We landed before dawn, out of sight of their watchtowers. We moved through forest, not open ground. When we emerged, we were already among their outer buildings. This emphasis on surprise and shock action characterized early Scandinavian raids. They preferred to strike when defenders were unprepared, during religious festivals, early mornings, or bad weather when watchfulness might lapse. Speed was essential. They aimed to complete their business, whether trade or raid, and return to their ships before local forces could organize effective resistance. When forced into direct confrontation, they typically fought in flexible formations that could quickly adapt to changing circumstances. The shield wall, warriors standing shoulder to shoulder with overlapping shields, provided defense against missiles and created a platform from which fighters could thrust spears at opponents. But unlike the rigid formations of armies like the Franks, Scandinavian warriors were trained to break and reform these formations as needed, to exploit opportunities or respond to threats. Most horrifying to their victims was not just their fighting skill, but the psychological warfare that accompanied it. Early Proto-Viking raiders learned that terror itself was a weapon. By developing fearsome reputations, they could sometimes achieve their goals with minimal fighting. Targets might surrender valuable goods rather than face the perceived horrors of resistance. This strategic use of fear would reach its apex in the later Viking Age, but its foundations were being laid in these earlier expeditions. The warriors who sailed from Scandinavia in the mid-8th century were developing not just the technical skills of warfare, but the psychological techniques that would make the very sight of their sails on the horizon cause for panic in coastal communities throughout Europe. As Halfdan's sword took shape under Ulf's hammer, it represented more than a personal weapon. It was part of an evolving military system that combined advanced technology, tactical innovation, and psychological warfare, a system that would soon challenge the established powers of Europe in ways they were utterly unprepared to counter. The dead speak. The burial practices of the Proto-Vikings provide some of our most valuable insights into their society, beliefs, and the violence that characterized their world. The Salm ship burials in Estonia, dating to around 750 AD, tell a particularly gruesome tale of early Scandinavian warfare abroad. Thorgrim the Old stood on the Estonian shore, overseeing the grim work of preparing his fallen comrades for burial. Of the 40 warriors who had sailed east with him, only 12 remained standing. The battle against the local tribe had been brutal. A trading dispute escalated to violence when the chieftain demanded more payment for passage through his territory than the Scandinavians were willing to give. "Lay Eirik there, beside Guthrum," Thorgrim directed, as men carried another body to the smaller of their 2 ships. They fought side by side in life. Let them journey to Valhalla together. The archaeological evidence from Salme shows that the warriors were buried with care and according to their status. The arrangement of bodies, particularly in the larger ship, suggests a hierarchical placement. Leaders were positioned in the centre with their finest weapons and personal items, while lower status warriors were placed toward the bow and stern. What makes the Salme burials particularly horrific are the wounds visible on the skeletal remains. One man's skull shows a perfect square hole, the impact point of a battle axe that would have killed him instantly. Another's hands were nearly severed at the wrists, typical defensive wounds sustained while trying to ward off blade strikes. A third was decapitated, the cut marks on his vertebrae indicating a powerful sword blow from behind. These wounds tell not just of violence, but of the nature of combat in this period. The injuries are predominantly to the front of bodies, suggesting face-to-face combat rather than ambush. Multiple wounds on some individuals indicate sustained fighting rather than quick executions. The presence of defensive wounds shows that these were trained warriors who attempted to protect themselves, not unprepared victims. "His arm was nearly severed," reported Halfdan, examining one of the fallen. Yet he continued fighting. "I saw him kill 2 more before he fell." Thorgrim nodded grimly. "Odin will welcome him. Prepare him with his weapons." The burial goods provide further insights into proto-Viking society. The warriors were interred with their weapons: swords, spears, axes and shields. Gaming pieces found in the burials suggest they passed time during voyages playing strategic board games, possibly similar to Hnefa Tuffle, a chess-like game popular in later Viking society. Personal items included combs, knives, and in some cases, food provisions for the journey to the afterlife. Most telling is the investment these burials represent. The Scandinavians sacrificed 2 ships, valuable assets that would have been difficult to replace. To honour their dead, they took time to arrange the bodies carefully and include appropriate grave goods, despite being in hostile territory after a costly battle. This suggests both religious importance attached to proper burial and the high status of the fallen warriors. The Salma ships were not grand ceremonial vessels built specifically for burial, like the later Oseberg or Gokstad ships from the Viking Age proper. They were working craft that had carried the warriors on their expedition. Their sacrifice for burial purposes underscores the importance of proper funerary rites, even in dangerous circumstances far from home. As night fell, Thorgrim supervised the final preparations. The ships, now filled with their grim cargo, were dragged further inland to a location less vulnerable to the sea. Earth was mounded over them, creating low burial mounds that would soon be overgrown and hidden from casual observation. "Will anyone remember them?" asked a young warrior, standing beside Thorgrim as they completed the burial. The old man gazed at the mounds, already dark against the darkening sky. "The Skalds will compose verses. Their kin will honour them at blots. And perhaps someday, others will find these ships and know that men from our lands came this far, fought bravely, and were properly honoured in death." His prediction would prove accurate, though not in the way he imagined. The Salme burials would remain undiscovered for over 1,250 years, until excavated by archaeologists in 2008, providing a window into this formative period of what would become the Viking Age, a rare glimpse of Scandinavian warriors operating far from home, decades before their descendants would shock the Christian world with the raid on Lindisfarne. The dead at Salma indeed speak to us across the centuries, telling tales of violence, honour, and the emerging phenomenon of Scandinavian expansion that would soon reshape the politics, economics and culture of much of Europe. Rivers of silver, rivers of blood. The Eastern Road. While later Viking activity in Western Europe would capture most historical attention, the earliest substantial Scandinavian expansion was eastward, establishing trade networks that would eventually connect northern Europe to the Byzantine Empire and Islamic Caliphate. These eastern ventures created the economic foundations that would fuel the more famous western raids. Halfdan stood at the helm of his own ship, leading his first independent expedition. At 24, he had participated in enough voyages to know the eastern routes well. Now, with his father Svein growing too old for the rigours of long journeys, Halfdan commanded a crew of 30 warriors sailing east across the Baltic. "There," he pointed as they approached the mouth of the river that would later be known as the Neva. "We'll follow this waterway to the lake the locals call Ladoga, then south along the river they call Volkhof. This route, from the Baltic Sea, via the Neva River to Lake Ladoga, then south along the Volkhof River, was becoming a well-established path for Scandinavian traders by the mid-8th century. Archaeological evidence from settlements along this route shows increasing Scandinavian presence, with distinctively Norse artefacts appearing in greater numbers as the century progressed. The most significant early settlement along this network was Staraya Ladoga, Old Ladoga, established near Lake Ladoga around 750 AD. Excavations have revealed a mixed community of Scandinavians, Slavs, Finns and Balts engaged in trade and craft production. Scandinavian-style buildings stood alongside those of local design. Workshops processed amber, antler, glass and metals, creating goods for both local use and long-distance trade. As Halfdan's ship and 2 companions navigate the Neva, they encountered the first challenge of river travel: rapids that prevented sailing or rowing. "Unload everything," Halfdan ordered when they reached the first serious obstacle. "We'll carry the cargo past the rapids and drag the ships overland." This portage technique, unloading ships carrying goods around obstacles and dragging lightened vessels over land, was essential to the Scandinavian Eastern enterprise. Their ships were designed to be relatively light for their size, making such portages feasible, if still grueling work. The ability to transition between sea and river travel gave proto-Vikings access to vast territories inaccessible to purely maritime powers. By navigating the complex river systems of Eastern Europe, they could reach resources and markets far inland, connecting coastal communities to interior populations and economies. After several days of alternating between rowing and portaging, Halfdan's expedition reached the settlement at Ladoga. Unlike their first cautious approaches years earlier, they were now expected and even welcomed. Regular trade had established relationships and protocols. "Halfdan Sveinsson," called out a Slavic merchant as they beached their ships. "Your father is not with you this year. He sends his greetings to Brynja," Halfdan replied in the trading pidgin that had developed to facilitate communication. "He grows old but still asks for the amber beads your wife makes." Such personal connections were crucial to the functioning of these early trade networks. In the absence of formal institutions or written contracts, trade relied heavily on personal relationships, reputation, and mutual understanding of customs and expectations. The goods exchanged in these Eastern networks were diverse. Scandinavians brought iron weapons and tools, walrus ivory, amber from Baltic shores, honey, and specialized craft items like combs made from antler. They returned with silver from Islamic lands, often in the form of dirhams, furs from the northern forests, wax, and increasingly, slaves captured in local conflicts or raids. The slave trade, though morally repugnant to modern sensibilities, was a significant component of early Proto-Viking economic activity. Enslaved people, captured in raids or purchased from local powers who conducted their own slave-taking expeditions, were transported to markets in the Byzantine Empire and Islamic Caliphate, where demand for labour was high. After spending several weeks trading at Ladoga, Halfdan prepared to venture further south, following the Folkov River toward Lake Ilmen and what would later become Novgorod. This southern journey represented the next phase of Scandinavian eastern expansion, pushing deeper into the continent, establishing new trading posts, and eventually connecting to the great river systems of the Dnieper and Volga that would lead to the Black and Caspian Seas. "We've heard there are new settlements to the south," Halfdan told his crew, "places where the Slavs gather furs and honey, places closer to the silver-rich lands of the east." This constant push for new opportunities characterized the eastern ventures. As each trading post became established and local populations adapted to Scandinavian presence, profit margins would naturally decrease. Entrepreneurial leaders like Halfdan continually sought new routes, new trading partners, and new resources to exploit. By the late 8th century, just as the first raids were beginning in Western Europe, Scandinavian traders had established a presence throughout much of what is now European Russia. They had connected the Baltic Sea to the vast river system of Eastern Europe, laying groundwork for the more extensive networks that would develop during the Viking Age proper. These eastern routes provided the economic foundation for much of what followed. The wealth accumulated through eastern trade, particularly silver from Islamic lands, financed shipbuilding, weapons production, and the consolidation of power in Scandinavia itself. Without the Eastern enterprise, the Western raids might never have developed the scale and impact that made them so historically significant. As Halfdan's ships pushed south into territories few Scandinavians had yet visited, he was participating in one of history's most consequential economic expansions, one that would eventually connect Northern Europe to Central Asia and the Middle East, reshaping the economies and societies of all regions involved. The Western Horizon. While Eastern trade routes were being established and expanded, some forward-thinking Scandinavian leaders began looking westward. The North Sea and Atlantic coasts offered different opportunities and challenges than the Baltic and Russian rivers. But the same basic combination of trading, raiding, and exploration characterized these early Western ventures. Bjorn Ironsides stood on the rocky shore of what would later be known as the Shetland Islands, surveying the landscape. His 3 ships had made the challenging crossing from Norway, navigating open ocean rather than the more protected waters of the Baltic. The journey had tested both vessels and crews, but proved that regular voyages to these western islands were feasible. Good harbours, he noted to Haakon, his second in command. Sheltered from the worst Atlantic storms, and look there, settlements. Small farming communities dotted the landscape, primarily populated by Pictish peoples with some admixture of Celtic influence. These settlements represented potential trading partners, or targets. Archaeological evidence from the northern and western Isles of Scotland shows Scandinavian presence by the mid to late 8th century, predating the Lindisfarne raid. Distinctive Scandinavian artefacts appear in local contexts, suggesting at least intermittent contact through trade or small-scale raiding. Unlike the eastern routes, where Scandinavians primarily sought trading opportunities, the western ventures from the beginning had a more complex character. The islands and coasts they encountered were often sparsely populated, but controlled by local powers with their own maritime traditions. Some areas, particularly the Christian monasteries of Ireland, Scotland, and northern England, offered concentrated wealth with relatively light defences. We should approach the main settlement openly, Bjorn decided. Show weapons, but keep them sheathed. Let's see what they offer in trade before considering other options. This pragmatic approach characterised many early Western contacts. Violence was an option, but not always the first choice. Trade, when possible, offered more sustainable long-term benefits, particularly in regions the Scandinavians intended to visit repeatedly. The Western voyages differed from Eastern expeditions in several key aspects. The sailing conditions were more challenging, with open ocean crossings requiring more advanced navigational skills and sturdier ships. The potential trading partners were more diverse, from the Pictish and Celtic communities of the Northern Isles to the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England and the Frankish territories of continental Europe. Most significantly, the western regions included wealthy Christian institutions, monasteries and churches that contained precious metals, manuscripts, and other valuable items. These religious centres, often located on coastal islands or near river mouths for communication purposes, were particularly vulnerable to seaborne attack. As Bjorn's party approached the main settlement, they were met by a group of local men, led by a chieftain, identifiable by his finer clothing and gold talk. They're cautious but not immediately hostile, Haakon observed. They've seen ships like ours before. Perhaps traders from Denmark or Frisia, Bjorn suggested. We may not be the first to venture this way. Indeed, archaeological and limited documentary evidence suggests that before the famous Lindisfarne raid, there had been increasing contact between Scandinavians and the British Isles. Some of this contact was likely peaceful trading, while other interactions may have involved small-scale raiding or exploration. The meeting with the local chieftain proved productive. Through gestures and the few words they had in common, trading terms that had spread along with goods, they established that Bjorn's party had iron tools, weapons, and Baltic amber to trade. The locals offered wool, leather goods, and information about nearby settlements, including a Christian monastery on a neighbouring island. They say the holy men have books bound in gold, Haakon reported after further discussions, and silver vessels for their rituals, few warriors to protect them. Bjorn considered this information carefully. We came to trade, not fight, but we should at least see this place of wealth before we decide our next move. The pragmatism of early Scandinavian expansion is often overlooked in popular accounts that emphasise violence. While they were certainly capable of brutal raiding when it suited their purposes, they were equally capable of peaceful trade, diplomatic negotiation, and strategic restraint when these approaches better served their interests. The Western ventures of the mid to late 8th century established knowledge and networks that would prove crucial when more intensive Viking activity began. Navigational information was gathered and shared, The locations of harbours, the patterns of currents and winds, the distribution of settlements. Political intelligence was accumulated. Which areas were wealthy, which were well defended, which were divided by internal conflicts that might be exploited. By the time the monks of Lindisfarne saw dragon-prowed ships approaching their shore in June 793, Scandinavians had already been voyaging to the British Isles and beyond for decades. The raid that traditionally marks the beginning of the Viking Age was not a sudden appearance of unknown Northmen, but the escalation of a presence that had been gradually growing for generations. As Bjorn's expedition prepared to investigate the monastery, they were participating in the final phase of pre-Viking expansion, the reconnaissance that would soon lead to the more systematic exploitation of Western European wealth through both trading and raiding. The first blood. The transition from proto-Viking activities to what historians recognise as the Viking Age proper was marked not by a sudden change in Scandinavian behaviour, but by an escalation in scale and a shift in target selection. The raid on Lindisfarne in 793 AD stands as the symbolic beginning of this new phase, but the patterns that would characterise it were established in earlier, less documented attacks. Ragnar stood at the prow of his ship as it approached the island monastery. Unlike Bjorn's exploratory expedition years earlier, Ragnar came with clear purpose. 6 ships followed his lead, each carrying 40 hardened warriors. This was no trading mission with violence as a backup option. This was a deliberate raid on a known wealthy target. "Remember," he called to his men as the monastery buildings came into view, "the Christian priests do not fight. Take what is valuable. Gold, silver, manuscripts with metal bindings. Take young, strong workers as captives. Kill only those who resist." The practical, almost business-like approach to violence characterised many early Viking raids. While later accounts would emphasise berserker fury and bloodlust, the reality was often more calculated. Violence was a tool employed strategically to achieve specific objectives with minimal risk to the raiders. The Lindisfarne raid, described in horrified terms by the Anglo-Saxon chronicler Alcuin, represented the culmination of developing trends rather than a revolutionary new approach. Its significance lay not in its tactics, but in its target, a major religious centre of the Northumbrian kingdom, a place of learning and spiritual significance whose violation sent shockwaves through Christian Europe. "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race," Alcuin wrote. "The church of St. Cuthbert is spattered with the blood of the priests of God, despoiled of all its ornaments." The horror expressed in such accounts stemmed not just from the violence itself, but from its context. Attacks on religious institutions violated medieval expectations about the sanctity of church properties. The seeming inability of Christian God to protect his most devoted servants raised troubling theological questions. The precision with which the raiders targeted valuable items suggested not just brutality, but calculated sacrilege. Archaeological evidence from Lindisfarne and other early raid sites confirms the selective nature of Viking violence. Valuable metalwork disappeared, while less portable wealth was often left behind. Bodies showing evidence of violence are found primarily among adult males who would have presented resistance, while women and children more commonly show evidence of capture rather than killing. As Ragnar's men moved methodically through the monastery complex, they encountered different responses from the inhabitants. Some monks fled toward hiding places on the island. Others knelt in prayer, continuing their devotions even as the raiders approached. A few younger, more robust brothers attempted to protect their elders and sacred treasures. "This one fights with a staff," called out Hastein, one of Ragnar's warriors, as he deflected a blow from a desperate monk. "He has courage, at least." "Take him alive if you can," Ragnar ordered. "Strong men bring good prices in the eastern markets." The slave-taking aspect of early Viking raids is often underemphasised in popular accounts that focus on violence and plunder. Yet captives represented valuable commodities in the trading networks Scandinavians had established, particularly in the Islamic world where demand for slaves remained high. Young, educated Christian captives were especially valuable, sometimes fetching prices higher than gold or silver of equivalent weight. Within hours, the raid was complete. The monastery's treasury had been emptied of precious metals. Selected manuscripts with valuable bindings were taken. Several dozen captives, primarily younger monks and servants, were bound and led to the ships. The buildings were not systematically destroyed, contrary to some later accounts. The raiders had no interest in expending effort on destruction that brought no profit. "The tide turns," Ragnar noted, looking to the horizon. "We sail with it. By nightfall, we should be far from any pursuit." This emphasis on speed and mobility characterized successful raids. The Vikings rarely lingered at raid sites, understanding that their advantage lay in surprise and shock rather than sustained confrontation. Their ships allowed them to appear suddenly, strike effectively, and disappear before local forces could organise a response. The Lindisfarne raid and similar attacks that followed represented a new phase in Scandinavian expansion, but one built on foundations laid in previous decades. The knowledge of targets, the development of appropriate tactics, the integration of raiding with trading networks for disposing of captives and plunder. All these elements had evolved gradually through earlier, smaller-scale activities. What made the Lindisfarne raid historically significant was not its uniqueness, but its visibility and impact. By attacking a major religious centre with connections throughout Christian Europe, the Vikings announced their presence on the historical stage in a way that could not be ignored. The psychological impact far exceeded the material damage, creating a climate of fear that would persist and grow as raids increased in frequency and scale. As Ragnar's ships disappeared over the horizon, leaving smoke and grief behind on the Holy Island, they carried with them not just plunder and captives, but the beginnings of a reputation that would make the very name Viking a byword for terror throughout Western Europe for centuries to come. The Crucible of Kings. Power and sacrifice. The success of early Viking expeditions both reflected and accelerated changes in Scandinavian political structures. Leaders who effectively organised profitable ventures abroad gained wealth and prestige that translated into increased power at home. This dynamic created a feedback loop that gradually shifted political organisation toward more centralised authority. Bjorn Ironsides stood before the assembled people at the Thing, the traditional assembly, where free men gathered to resolve disputes and make decisions affecting the community. After 5 successful Western expeditions, his status had grown enormously. Gold and silver arm rings gleamed on his massive forearms. His sword hilt was wrapped with silver wire. Behind him stood a household of warriors, equipped with the finest weapons and armour his wealth could provide. "The Danish king sends raiders to our southern shores," Bjorn announced. 3 farmsteads burned last month, 2 fishing boats seized. This cannot continue. The threat from Denmark was real, but it also presented an opportunity. By positioning himself as the community's defender against external threats, Bjorn was taking another step toward formal leadership, moving from successful expedition organizer to regional protector. "What would you have us do?" asked an elder farmer, respected for his wisdom but too old now for warfare. "Unite," Bjorn replied simply. "Not just this district, but the 5 surrounding regions. Together, we can build a fleet to protect our shores. Together, we can even carry the fight to the Danes if necessary." This proposal, consolidation of previously independent districts under his leadership, represented a significant political development. Traditionally, Scandinavian society had been organised around local chieftains whose power extended only over small territories. Bjorn was proposing something more ambitious: regional kingship justified by military necessity. The archaeological record from 8th century Scandinavia shows evidence of this political consolidation. Defensive structures become more elaborate and standardized across wider territories. Elite burials show increasing concentration of wealth. Settlement patterns suggest the emergence of central places that functioned as seats of regional power. To cement his proposed alliance, Bjorn understood that more than practical arguments were needed. Religious sanction was essential. After the thing concluded with tentative support for his proposal, he met with the local Godi, a chieftain who also served as religious leader. "The people need a sign that the gods favour this union," the Godi advised. "A sacrifice worthy of Odin All-Father, who values power and wisdom." Bjorn nodded grimly. At the next full moon, let all 5 districts send representatives to witness. The sacrifice took place at a sacred grove where ancient trees surrounded a small clearing. Representatives from all 5 districts gathered, standing in concentric circles around a central altar stone. Bjorn had provided 9 horses, 9 cattle, 9 sheep, and 9 hogs, a princely offering that demonstrated both his wealth and his seriousness. The animals were slaughtered methodically, their blood collected in bowls. The Godi sprinkled the assembled crowd with the blood using a ritual branch, symbolically connecting them to the sacrifice and to each other. The meat would later be consumed in a communal feast that further reinforced the new bonds between previously separate communities. "Odin All-Father, wise in war and cunning in peace," the Godi intoned, raising a spear that symbolized the god's weapon. "Accept our offering, bless our union, grant victory to our ships and prosperity to our lands." Such religious ceremonies played a crucial role in the consolidation of power. By associating political unification with traditional religious practices, ambitious leaders like Bjorn legitimized their expansion of authority. The communal nature of the rituals helped create a sense of shared identity among previously distinct groups. Archaeological evidence of such sacrificial practices comes from sites like Uppukra in Sweden, where a ceremonial building was used for religious activities from the 3rd to the 9th century AD. Animal bones showing evidence of ritual slaughter have been found, along with weapons and valuable items apparently offered to the gods. Human sacrifice, while less common, is also attested in some contexts, particularly in burials of high-status individuals who are accompanied by sacrifice servants or slaves. The political consolidation occurring in Scandinavia during this period was not unique. Similar processes were happening throughout Europe, as post-Roman political structures evolved toward what would become medieval kingdoms. What made the Scandinavian case distinctive was the role of external raiding and trading in accelerating this process. Leaders who successfully organised expeditions abroad gained resources that could be used to reward followers, impress rivals, and fund further enterprises. The organisational skills required to lead such expeditions translated well to broader political leadership. The networks established through foreign ventures created connections between previously isolated communities, facilitating larger political units. As Bjorn's influence grew following the sacrificial ceremony, he began constructing a more permanent seat of power, a hall larger than any previously built in the region, where he could host feasts, settle disputes, and receive visitors. Such halls, examples of which have been excavated at sites like Leira in Denmark and Gamla Uppsala in Sweden, served as physical manifestations of emerging royal power. The consolidation of authority was not without resistance. Traditional local leaders often opposed the expansion of power by men like Bjorn. Some communities preferred their independence to the protection offered by regional kings. Religious conservatives sometimes questioned innovations introduced by leaders who had encountered different practices abroad. Yet the trajectory was clear. By the late 8th century, as the Viking Age began in earnest, Scandinavia was transitioning from a region of numerous small chiefdoms to one of fewer, larger proto-kingdoms. This political evolution both enabled and was fueled by the expanding Viking activity abroad. The raids that would soon terrorize much of Europe were not just opportunistic plundering, but increasingly organized operations sanctioned and sometimes led by emerging kings seeking to enhance their power and prestige. As the communal feast following the sacrifice continued into the night, Bjorn moved among the representatives of the 5 districts, cementing alliances, making promises, and laying the groundwork for a new political order, one that would soon project its power far beyond the shores of Scandinavia. The forge of conflict. External pressures played a significant role in shaping the emergence of Viking activity. As the 8th century progressed, Scandinavians found themselves increasingly affected by developments in the broader European world, particularly the expansion of Christian kingdoms to their south. Halfdan stood before King Sigurd, delivering news gathered during his recent trading expedition along the southern Baltic coast. The Frank king Charlemagne continues to push northward, he reported. The Saxons resist, but many have been forcibly baptized. Those who refuse the Christian god are executed. Sigurd, now recognized as king of a substantial territory following his father Bjorn's death, frowned deeply. How far north have they come? Their armies have reached the Elbe River, Halfdan replied. Some say the Frank king will not stop until all pagan peoples acknowledge his god and his authority. This threat from Frankish expansion under Charlemagne represented a significant external pressure on Scandinavian societies. The Saxon Wars, which lasted from 772 to 804 AD, brought Frankish military power to the southern borders of Denmark. Charlemagne's tactics included not just military conquest, but forced conversion, destruction of pagan religious sites, and execution of those who resisted Christianization. For Scandinavian leaders observing these developments, the message was clear. The Christian powers to the south represented an existential threat to their way of life, religious practices, and political independence. We have 3 options, Sigurd declared to his assembled advisors. We can wait for the Franks to reach our borders and then fight defensively. We can strike south now, supporting the remaining Saxon resistance. Or we can turn our attention elsewhere to targets that will bring wealth without directly confronting Frankish power. This strategic calculation, how best to respond to the pressure from expanding Christian kingdoms, influenced the direction and nature of early Viking activity. The decision by many Scandinavian leaders to focus their attention westward toward the British Isles, Ireland, and the Atlantic Islands represented in part a strategic choice to avoid direct confrontation with the continent's strongest military power. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. Viking activity in the late 8th and early 9th centuries concentrated on targets that were wealthy but relatively weakly defended. Isolated monasteries, divided kingdoms, coastal settlements. The raiders initially avoided well-defended centres of power, like Charlemagne's court at Aachen or major Frankish cities. The religious dimension of this conflict should not be underestimated. Charlemagne's campaigns against the Saxons had explicitly religious goals, including the destruction of sacred sites like the Irminsul, a pillar sacred to the Saxons, and forced baptism of conquered populations. For Scandinavians who worshipped the old gods, these actions represented not just political aggression, but an assault on their cosmic order. The Christians claim their god is the only true god, the Godi reminded Sigurd. They destroy our sacred groves and pillars wherever they conquer. They kill those who honour the Aesir and Vanir. This religious conflict provided additional motivation for attacks on Christian targets. When Viking raiders struck monasteries like Lindisfarne, they were not just seeking portable wealth, but striking symbolic blows against a religious system they perceived as threatening their own. The desecration of Christian sacred objects and spaces, reported in many accounts, reflected this religious dimension of the conflict. The timing of the intensification of Viking raids correlates significantly with Charlemagne's Saxon campaigns. As Frankish pressure on Scandinavia's southern approaches increased, Viking activity in other directions expanded. This pattern suggests that external pressure was a significant factor in catalysing the transition from smaller-scale proto-Viking activities to the full-blown Viking expansion that began in the 790s. After considering his options, Sigurd made his decision. We will send ships west and north, the British Isles, the Frankish coast, the islands of the northern seas. We will avoid direct confrontation with Charlemagne's main forces for now, but we will strike at the edges of the Christian world. He turned to Halfdan. Prepare 3 ships. You will lead them to the northern islands we've heard of, beyond the land of the Picts. Explore, trade where profitable, and identify targets that might be revisited with larger forces. This strategic approach, probing for weaknesses, gathering intelligence and gradually escalating activity, characterized the early phase of Viking expansion. Rather than a single dramatic eruption of violence, the Viking phenomenon developed through increasingly organized and ambitious expeditions, building on knowledge gained in earlier ventures. The forge of conflict with expanding Christian powers helped shape Viking activity in other ways as well. The need to respond to this threat accelerated political consolidation within Scandinavia, as communities united under stronger leaders for mutual protection. It stimulated technological development, particularly in shipbuilding and weapons production, as Scandinavians sought advantages to offset the greater resources of their southern neighbours. Perhaps most significantly, the religious and cultural conflict with Christian Europe helped forge a stronger sense of Scandinavian identity. Despite regional differences, the peoples of what would later become Denmark, Norway and Sweden increasingly recognised their shared interests and cultural practices in opposition to the Christian world to their south. As Halfdan prepared his ships for the Western expedition, he was participating in a response to external pressure that would reshape not just Scandinavia, but much of Europe. The Vikings, who would soon become infamous throughout the Christian world, were not just opportunistic raiders, but actors in a larger geopolitical and religious conflict, one that would continue for centuries and ultimately transform both sides. The Raven banner rises. By the final decades of the 8th century, the elements that would characterize the Viking Age were coalescing. Political consolidation within Scandinavia, external pressure from Christian expansion, technological advances in shipbuilding and weaponry, and established knowledge of foreign targets all combined to enable the dramatic escalation of Scandinavian activity, a broad that began with the Lindisfarne raid of 793 AD. Ragnar stood on a headland overlooking the harbour where 23 ships prepared for departure. Each vessel carried between 30 and 40 warriors, nearly 1,000 men in total, the largest Scandinavian expedition yet assembled. Above his flagship flew a banner bearing the image of a raven, symbol of Odin the war god. Never before has such a force sailed from our shores, observed Hastein, now Ragnar's trusted lieutenant. The Christian lands will tremble at our coming. The scale of this expedition represented a significant evolution from earlier ventures. While previous decades had seen ships operating individually or in small groups, by the 790s, Scandinavian leaders were capable of organising larger fleets for coordinated operations. This escalation reflected both the increasing political organisation of Scandinavian society and the accumulating wealth from earlier successful raids and trading expeditions. Archaeological evidence for this escalation comes from several sources. Defensive works in potential target areas were hastily improved during this period, suggesting awareness of a growing threat. Contemporary chronicles record increasingly frequent and larger-scale attacks. Silver hoards buried in Scandinavia show a dramatic increase in foreign wealth flowing north. Our targets are chosen, Ragnar reminded his captains at their final council. First, the island monastery, the Saxons call Lindisfarne. Its wealth is confirmed by traders who have seen its golden gospels and silver reliquaries. Its defences are minimal, a few monks with farm tools at best. The selection of Lindisfarne as a target was strategic. Located on a tidal island off the Northumbrian coast, it was a major religious centre but physically isolated from immediate military support. Its wealth was concentrated and portable, precisely the combination Vikings sought. Most importantly, its religious significance meant that an attack would have psychological impact far beyond the material damage inflicted. After Lindisfarne, we separate, Ragnar continued. 5 ships to the northern islands to establish a base for future operations. 8 ships to raid the Frankish coast, focusing on isolated monasteries and trading settlements. The remainder will continue down the English coast, striking targets of opportunity before returning home. This diversification of targets reflected growing sophistication in Viking strategy. Rather than concentrating all forces on a single objective, leaders like Ragnar understood the advantages of dispersing after initial operations, making their movements less predictable, spreading defender resources thin, and gathering intelligence about a wider range of potential future targets. As the fleet prepared to depart, a ritual sacrifice was conducted on the beach. 9 captives, prisoners taken in local conflicts, were hanged from trees in a sacred grove, dedicated to Odin in exchange for favourable winds and successful raiding. "Blood for the All-Father," intoned the Godi as he moved among the hanging men. "Souls for his hall, victory for our ships." Such sacrifices, attested in both archaeological evidence and later written sources, underscored the religious dimension of Viking expansion. While economic motives were certainly primary, many participants also understood their activities in religious terms, as actions that pleased their gods and demonstrated their devotion. The fleet departed with the dawn tide, an impressive sight as the line of dragon-prowed ships stretched across the horizon. For the warriors aboard, this expedition represented opportunity for wealth, for status, for adventure. For the leaders who organised it, it was a projection of power and a statement of ambition. For the societies they left behind, it was a release of pressure, directing energies outward that might otherwise have led to internal conflict. For their targets, it represented something else entirely, the beginning of a period of terror and disruption that would last for generations. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle would later record the Lindisfarne raid with horror. In this year, fierce, foreboding omens came over the land of Northumbria, and the ravaging of heathen men destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne through brutal robbery and slaughter. As Ragnar's fleet disappeared over the horizon, the Viking Age proper had begun. The experimental, smaller-scale activities of previous decades had evolved into a systematic enterprise of raiding, trading, and exploration that would reshape the political, economic, and cultural landscape of Europe. The raven banner flying above Ragnar's ship symbolised more than just his personal standard. It represented the emergence of a new power in European affairs, one that operated according to different rules and values than the Christian kingdoms of the south. For the next 3 centuries, the sight of such banners on the horizon would signal the arrival of the most feared seafarers of the medieval world. Legacy of blood and silver. The world they made. The emergence of the Vikings from their proto-Viking predecessors transformed not just Scandinavia, but much of the known world. Their impact extended far beyond the immediate violence of their raids to reshape trade networks, settlement patterns, political structures, and cultural exchanges across Europe and beyond. Halfdan, now in his 60s, with grey in his beard and scars across his body, stood at the stern of his ship as it approached the trading settlement at the mouth of the Seine. What had been a small, vulnerable target for early raids had transformed into a thriving marketplace where Scandinavian ships were now a common sight. Some of his countrymen had even settled permanently in the region, intermarrying with local families and adopting elements of Frankish culture, while maintaining their distinctive Scandinavian identity. "Much has changed since our first voyage here," he remarked to his son Guthrum, who now commanded his own ship in their small fleet. "Then they fled at the sight of our sails. Now they prepare goods for trade and keep silver ready." This evolution from targets of opportunity to integrated trading partners characterised many regions affected by Viking activity. Initial violent contacts gradually gave way to more complex relationships involving trade, settlement, political alliances, and cultural exchange. Archaeological evidence for this transformation appears throughout the Viking world. In places like Dublin, York, and Novgorod, what began as temporary Viking bases evolved into permanent settlements and eventually major urban centres where Scandinavian and local populations mixed. Artifacts show increasing hybridization of styles and techniques as cultural boundaries blurred. The trade networks established and expanded by Vikings connected previously isolated economies into a more integrated system. Silver from Islamic lands flowed north through Russia and into Scandinavia, then west to England and Ireland. Slaves captured in the Slavic territories were transported to Byzantine and Islamic markets. Luxury goods like walrus ivory from the North Atlantic reached Mediterranean ports. Our ships now sail routes our fathers could only dream of, Halfdan continued. From the northern islands where the sun barely sets in summer to the great southern city of Miklagard, where the emperor's palace is plated with gold. This expansion of horizons represented one of the most significant impacts of Viking activity. By establishing maritime connections across vast distances, they created networks of communication and exchange that transcended the more land-focused political units of the period. Information, technologies, and ideas travelled along with goods and people, stimulating innovation and cultural development. Political structures throughout Europe were transformed in response to Viking pressure. In England, smaller kingdoms consolidated into larger units better able to organise resistance. In Francia, the need to defend against Viking raids accelerated the development of feudal relationships, as central authorities granted land to local powers in exchange for military service. In Russia, Scandinavian warriors became integrated into local power structures, eventually contributing to the formation of the first Russian state. The kings at home now rule lands our grandfathers would have thought impossible to govern. Guthrum observed, "They build stone halls and mint their own coins with Christian symbols, though they still honour the old gods in private." This political evolution within Scandinavia itself was perhaps the most profound, long-term consequence of Viking expansion. The wealth, prestige, and organisational experience gained through foreign ventures accelerated the consolidation of power under regional kings. By the end of the Viking Age, the previously fragmented political landscape of Scandinavia had been transformed into the recognisable precursors of the medieval kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Religious change accompanied this political transformation. Contact with Christian Europe gradually led to the conversion of Scandinavian societies, though the process was complex and uneven. Some leaders adopted Christianity for political advantages, while their populations remained attached to traditional practices. In other cases, genuine religious conviction spread through missionary activity and cultural exchange. "Your children will likely pray to the White Christ," Halfdan told his son, with a mixture of resignation and pragmatism. "The old ways fade as our people settle among Christians and marry their daughters. Even at home, the Christian priests gain influence with each passing year." This religious transformation would ultimately prove one of the most enduring legacies of the Viking Age. By the 11th century, Scandinavia had been largely integrated into Christian Europe, ending its distinctive religious identity, but facilitating its participation in broader European cultural and political developments. The settlement of Vikings in new lands created lasting demographic and linguistic impacts. In places like Normandy, named for the Northmen who settled there, the Danelaw in England, and parts of Scotland and Ireland, Scandinavian genetic and linguistic influences remain detectable to the present day. The modern English language contains hundreds of words derived from Old Norse, a testament to the intensity of cultural contact during this period. As Halfdan's ships docked at the Seine trading settlement, they were greeted not with fear, but with the routine activities of commerce. Merchants approached with samples of their wares. Locals called out greetings in a pidgin language that mixed Frankish and Norse elements. A Christian priest stood nearby, ready to offer blessings in exchange for donations, but careful not to press his faith too aggressively on the Scandinavian visitors. This scene, peaceful interaction between peoples who had begun as enemies, represented the culmination of processes set in motion by those first proto-Viking expeditions a century earlier. What had begun as desperate ventures by hungry Scandinavians seeking resources abroad had evolved into a complex network of relationships that would permanently alter the cultural, economic, and political landscape of Europe. The legacy of the Vikings and their proto-Viking predecessors extended far beyond the blood they spilled and the silver they seized. They created connections between previously isolated regions, stimulated urban development in places where they settled, catalyzed political consolidation both at home and abroad, and participated in cultural exchanges that enriched all societies involved. Their story is not just one of violence and plunder, but of adaptation, innovation, and ultimately integration into the wider European world they had once terrorized. The blood-dimmed tide. While the long-term legacy of Viking activity included many constructive developments in trade, settlement, and cultural exchange, we cannot overlook the immediate horrific impact of their expansion on target populations. The violence that characterized many Viking operations, particularly in the early phase, left physical and psychological scars that would shape European consciousness for centuries. Alcuin of York, the renowned Anglo-Saxon scholar serving at Charlemagne's court, wrote with anguish after receiving news of the Lindisfarne raid. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The Church of St. Cuthbert is spattered with the blood of the priests of God, despoiled of all its ornaments. This contemporary reaction captures the shock that Viking violence provoked in Christian Europe. The targeting of religious institutions, the killing of clergy, and the theft of sacred objects represented not just material loss, but spiritual trauma in a deeply religious society. Archaeological evidence confirms the reality behind such accounts. Excavations at raided sites reveal burn layers, scattered human remains showing evidence of violent death, and the conspicuous absence of valuable metalwork that would normally be present in religious contexts. Mass graves dating to this period sometimes contain bodies showing defensive wounds or execution-style killings consistent with raid scenarios. The psychological impact of Viking raids extended far beyond their physical destruction. Their ability to appear suddenly from the sea, strike with overwhelming force, and disappear before effective resistance could be organised created a climate of pervasive fear in coastal communities throughout Europe. Contemporary prayers included specific petitions for protection from the fury of the Northmen, a testament to the terror they inspired. This fear was amplified by the perceived religious dimension of the conflict. Christians interpreted Viking attacks on churches and monasteries not just as material plundering, but as assaults on Christianity itself. The paganism of the attackers added a cosmic dimension to the struggle, framing it as a contest between religious systems rather than merely political or economic competition. The slave-taking aspect of Viking raids added another layer of horror for affected communities. Unlike material goods, which could eventually be replaced, captured family members and neighbours represented permanent, irreplaceable losses. The knowledge that loved ones might be suffering in distant lands, sold into servitude, with little hope of return, created enduring trauma in raided communities. Church records and chronicles from the period are filled with accounts of particularly shocking Viking atrocities, though some may have been exaggerated for rhetorical effect. Reports of ritualistic killings, such as the blood eagle, allegedly a form of execution where the victim's ribs were severed from the spine and pulled outward, to resemble wings, with the lungs drawn out through the wounds, appear in later sagas, but remain controversial among historians regarding their historical accuracy. What is not controversial is that Viking raids represented a devastating experience for target communities, combining physical destruction, loss of life, economic damage, and profound psychological trauma. The impact was particularly severe because many early targets were unprepared for this type of threat, having no recent experience with large-scale seaborne raids. The response to this violence evolved over time. Initial shock gave way to more organised defensive measures. Coastal watchtowers were constructed or improved. Local defence forces were reorganised for faster response. Religious institutions moved valuable items inland or constructed stronger buildings to protect them. Political authorities implemented new taxation systems specifically to fund anti-Viking defences. By the mid-9th century, the element of surprise that had made early Viking raids so effective was diminishing. Target populations had adapted to the threat, developing both physical defences and social systems better suited to responding to raid scenarios. This adaptation forced Vikings to evolve their own tactics, leading to larger-scale operations, longer campaigns, and eventually semi-permanent bases from which to conduct activities. The violence of the Viking expansion thus acted as a catalyst for military, political, and social change throughout Europe. Communities that survived the initial shock emerged stronger, better organised, and more capable of collective action. Paradoxically, the very brutality that characterised early Viking activity stimulated developments that would eventually limit its effectiveness and channel Scandinavian energies into more constructive forms of interaction. The blood-dimmed tide of Viking violence, horrific as it was for those who experienced it directly, ultimately contributed to the transformation of European society in ways that would have been impossible to predict when the first dragon-proud ships appeared on the horizon. The terror they inspired produced not just victims, but survivors who adapted, organised, and ultimately integrated their former tormentors into a new and more complex European order. The saga continues. The transition from proto-Viking activities to the full Viking Age represents not an endpoint, but a beginning. The opening chapter of a 3-century saga that would see Scandinavians establish settlements from Newfoundland to the Black Sea, found kingdoms, convert to Christianity, and eventually be absorbed into the broader European cultural and political framework. As our narrative concludes, it is worth reflecting on how the formative period we have explored, the decades before and immediately after the Lindisfarne raid, established patterns that would characterise the entire Viking phenomenon. The pragmatic approach to violence and trade that marked early proto-Viking expeditions remained a constant throughout the Viking Age. While popular imagination often portrays Vikings as berserker warriors driven by bloodlust, the historical reality shows them as practical opportunists who used violence selectively and engaged in peaceful trade when it better served their interests. This flexibility was a key to their success across diverse environments and against varied opponents. The technological advantage provided by their ships remained crucial throughout the Viking period. Though the design of Viking vessels evolved over time, becoming larger and more specialised for different functions, the basic characteristics that made them so effective, shallow draft, flexibility, dual propulsion, continued to give Scandinavians mobility advantages over their competitors. Control of the seas and rivers remained the foundation of Viking power projection until the end of the era. The complex relationship between external activity and internal political development that began in the Proto-Viking period continued to shape Scandinavian society. Success abroad translated